Heaven's Feel 2, Lost Butterfly, is utterly amazing. But it's not perfect. Hey, it's me, Manpig. If you live in the US, you'll know that Lost Butterfly has recently been screening in theaters. Now, I am a massive, huge-ass Type Moon fanatic, so there was no way I wanted to miss the hype for this one. However, unfortunately, I don't live in the US, so I had no way to watch the movie in theaters. So I saw it on a cam rip instead. Yep, the whole movie from a cam rip. Look, if you're as obsessed with Type Moon as me, cam rips are nothing. Do you know how many fucking months it took for me to get Tsukihime working on a Mac? Anyway, I watched Heaven's Feel 2 through this cam rip in order to see if the movie would fail to live up to my expectations or reach my greatest hopes. For this, I actually watched the movie twice. Once during the same time as many other screenings at 3 AM in the fucking morning, and super tired just to know whether my worries or expectations were well met, and a second time to actually double check on those thoughts and opinions and make sure they were all solid clear. This time without the tiredness of being up at 3 AM and actually watching it for enjoyment. I'll say in advance that this video will not synopsize any plot, and will be assuming that you too have watched Lost Butterfly or have read Heaven's Feel, since I'm mostly going to be delving into the choices of the film itself, talking about certain scenes and comparing it to the original visual novel. And of course, my overall thoughts with all of that being said. If you haven't experienced Heaven's Feel in any way yet, do not watch this video. Partially because it is a spoiler warning, but also because you're literally going to have no idea what you're listening to. I'll be doing constant comparisons with the movie and the visual novel in this video, so if you're interested, do stay tuned. I'll also say that for this video, I'll be using the cam rips footage since that's all I can use, so if you hate low quality video, I'm sorry, just listen to it like a podcast, I guess? Anyway, that's pretty much everything out of the way for pre-talk, so let's get into the actual review. I'll start off by sharing my long-winded thoughts on the movie that came before it, Presage Flower, as it'll be important for my thoughts on Lost Butterfly. Personally, I thought the movie was very good, but definitely not something I'd consider amazing, nor did it reach my expectations of being as good as the original visual novel source. Its visuals were great, and its direction was fantastic, setting a great tone with insane attention to detail with its symbolism, foreshadowing, facial expressions, and so on. However, despite this, it wasn't as direct as it could have been. Fate Stay Night as a visual novel is very monologue heavy, and thus understanding Shiro's character thought process heavily depends on that. That's why everyone misunderstands Shiro for being an obtusely stubborn retard in earlier routes, when he's actually far more smarter and tactical than his words would make you believe. Not only that, but a lot of the explanations for details in the world and the rules are simply hard to convey with the short exposition given by a simple runtime of a movie. While I'm not saying audiences need to or should be spoon-fed information, these are still problems that arose from the change in medium, and the fact that not enough was done to remedy this meant that it was possible to miss details if you're not an avid Gnostiverse fanatic that researches almost everything. And to back this up, I've actually had several people who I've talked to say this, and that while they got the gist of things, they were also very confused in certain places and on the explanations of certain rules. Which is why I consider it to be a point of contention in the first place, since honestly I did not notice any of that when I first watched it. I do think though that these problems are inevitable, as a movie will simply not be able to explain everything. That's a hilarious expectation. There were also important scenes though that were cut or replaced that I would have preferred that they stayed as they were, especially considering we got an anime original 15-minute prelude to how Sakura's relationship with Shiro began. Don't get me wrong, it was fantastic and certainly added to those who have already read the visual novel, but to those who haven't, it was added in place of things that made the original Heaven's Feel route so interesting. But we'll talk about that later. Overall, I gave Presage Flower an 8.5 out of 10. I'll say right now, if you're a visual novel reader or an anime fan that's really anal about anime adaptations doing their best to be accurate to the original sources, you're going to be sorely disappointed with Lost Butterfly, even more so than Presage Flower. Because Lost Butterfly takes a rather large amount of liberties with the story and characters compared to what you'd normally expect from an anime adaptation. Now hear me out fully so you don't misunderstand my point, but I want to bring up that Dean Stay Night, the adaptation that almost everyone I know hates but deals with because it's the only Fate route adaptation, is actually more accurate to the source than Lost Butterfly is overall. Because ultimately, Dean adapts the route the same. They did add stuff, but that's it. They added stuff to the original story, and the base story was ultimately 100% the same. Lost Butterfly, however, did not do that. Instead, it replaced a lot of the scenes for other ones, and also cut some scenes in favor for anime original scenes that the visual novel did not have. However, I actually do not think that that itself was bad. Far from it. In fact, for certain areas, those liberties actually improved on the story compared to the visual novel. For instance, the scene where Sakura as the Shadow goes into a wonderland that screams that Studio Shaft was secretly behind it before killing Gilgamesh and a bunch of people was far better than what the visual novel had. The visual novel had a grotesque back alleyway disposal-like sequence, which I felt was very underwhelming and only there to show the events. However, the anime original liberties in the scene adds a sense of unnervingness and creates a lot more shock when shit hits the fan, not to mention the symbolism in the wonderland, like the animals in the river representing the servants that she already ate as the Shadow. All of that was fucking great, and it's not the only change. I think the movie did better than the visual novel, which we'll talk about later when we start comparing. Ultimately, if you're here for complete accuracy, this is far from that. This movie strays a lot from the original source, but if you ask me, a good amount of the changes are to its benefit rather than a detriment. At the same time though, some liberties were not for the better, and this is a problem I had with the majority of the liberties in Presage Flower. The most obvious example is the cutting of most of the Ilia bonding scenes, and the complete erasure of any of the church scenes. This made some of Heaven's Field's side characters, specifically Kirei and Ilia, get a lot less depth compared to the original visual novel. Let me explain further. Both Kirei and Ilia play incredibly large roles in the original route. For instance, in Heaven's Feel, Shiro actually does not form an alliance with Rin unlike in the other routes. Now since Rin isn't Shiro's guide, Shiro has to find another source of info for the war. Unsurprisingly, he goes to the church, and thus in Heaven's Feel, he talks to Kirei not only once, but on many occasions. In Presage Flower, we only see a snippet of the scene after he rescues Ayako and the Mapo Tofu scene where Kirei tells Shiro about the war going wrong. However, in the original visual novel, Kirei is the character that answers most of Shiro's questions after Saber gave him the quick rundown. In the original visual novel, Kirei and Shiro actually develop a strange connection to one another, and that actually later develops into a strange frenemy relationship that the two mutually share. Kirei becomes like a foil to Shiro in certain aspects, how they're both empty and want to find fulfillment, but in different ways. This super interesting character dynamic between them is only delved into in Heaven's Feel, and it was done so since the beginning of the route and stays an important development throughout the route. But unfortunately, a lot of that is cut out in the movies. In the movies, we get light exposition from Saber telling Shiro how Kiritsugu was in the last war, and Kirei telling Shiro how Kiritsugu refused the Grail. But in the visual novel, it was actually a lot more in detail and a lot more unbiased, since in the movies, he seemed to detest Kiritsugu. Originally, he truthfully told Shiro how Kiritsugu acted and tells him that he was an efficient machine at his job, and depicted him as a proper hero of justice. Kirei is who reveals to Shiro more of the details about the events in the Fourth War, and that is actually what first cracked his attachment to being a hero of justice, which we all know is extremely important in Heaven's Feel overall story. That itself was not a huge problem though, as Shiro ultimately got that attachment broken down by Ilia and the shitty events of the route. However, this alternate method ultimately cut out all of Kirei's death, as well as his intricate relationship with Shiro, which will make certain scenes that will happen in Spring Song far less impactful and deeper than they originally were. However, as I said previously, while I do think that it is a huge shame these scenes had to be cut, I completely understand why they had to do that. Runtime exists, and it's impossible to fit the entire route in 3 movies. Although that does make me curious on how they will handle the scenes in Spring Song, since the scenes' emotional impacts are heavily dependent on their unorthodox kinship with one another. The second character of contention is Ilia, or as I refer to, the second heroine of Heaven's Feel. You might not know this since Sakura is the main heroine of Heaven's Feel, but Ilia is actually the sub-heroine of Heaven's Feel, and the movies actually cut out most of her scenes. In the original visual novel, you required to bond with her in order to progress the story, and in the original visual novel, had many scenes where she and Shiro would meet up and the two would get to know each other and get a lot closer. We got to see Shiro try to reach out to Ilia as an Ainsburn after Kirei told him the relationship that the Ainsburns had with Kiritsugu, and Ilia's slow but overall acceptance of Shiro over time. In the visual novel, we had plenty of scenes of the two. They would have walks together. They would promise to meet up in the park and Shiro would do his best to keep it, talking about random things just for fun. Shiro would invite Ilia to his house, with Ilia learning about his lifestyle and the house that Kiritsugu had lived in. These scenes establish an extremely strong bond between the two, which becomes very important later on. Yet, all of those scenes were entirely cut out in the movies. Again, I completely understand why they had to do that, and that it was impossible to keep everything due to runtime. But the lack of these scenes ultimately meant that the movies would not showcase that strong, genuine bond that the two characters had. In fact, in the original visual novel, Ilia was the reason Shiro lost his arm, as he actually dove to protect Ilia from the Shadow's attack, rather than have the Shadow go full-on against Roaius. Also, in the original route, we actually got a full scene in the church where Kirei does his best to save Shiro, and we actually get a detailed explanation of the arm's abilities. Not only the risks, but also the abilities that Shiro could potentially gain from them. In the movie, that whole scene was completely cut out as well. Although the movie did have Rin summarize the risks briefly, it did not explain how the arm worked, nor did it share what Shiro was able to do with said arm. It overall fell into the case of, they did try to fix it, and ultimately it works for the story purposes, but it doesn't manage to explain everything and is kind of a plot hole. But I'm getting off track. In the second half, there was an entire scene with Ilia, where she sings from how happy she was to be with Shiro, because at that point, they had grown to become very close with one another, and clearly valued each other immensely, with Shiro noting that Ilia was basically his little sister at that point. But they turned that important scene into only a small fraction of a small montage, and because of that choice, it just did not showcase the meaning and the touching emotion that the original scene was intended to have. However, Lost Butterfly also took initiative and made some new scenes as well as modify an existing one to establish a similar bond instead. We had Ilia talk with Shiro outside of the Grail War at the beginning of the movie, and have Ilia help Shiro decide to protect those that he loved rather than everyone. Originally, this scene was meant to further establish their bond, as by then they were already relatively close. After hearing Ilia's words after an insane bunch of internal torment, Ilia would say that she would always be Shiro's ally no matter what he would do. And then she helps give Shiro the willpower to protect Sakura regardless of the events. I do think the movie pulled off the scene fine, but the visual novel just did it overall better. Finally, and this is the best one, the complete anime original scene with Taiga that Ilia overheard, where she told Kiritsugu's story to Sakura, was absolutely fantastic, as it finally made certain events in Spring Song, that I won't spoil, feel genuine, as Ilia learns that Kiritsugu did indeed try to find her, and that she had no reason to hate him or Shiro. Without that scene, other scenes that will take place in Spring Song would outright feel extremely out of place and out of character, as the movies originally lacked the Ilia bonding scenes that made those scenes possible in Spring Song. Those scenes relied heavily on not only Shiro's attachment to Ilia, but also Ilia's love for Shiro, and it was extremely important for the two to establish their bond to one another to make the scenes work. And ultimately, Lost Butterfly managed to do that with the scenes that it added. It wasn't as genuine, nor was it nearly as fleshed out as the original source, but ultimately, a bond is there, and it will work to make those scenes feel in character and genuine. This liberty ultimately fixed my largest problem and worry that arose from Presage Flower. So a massive bravo to Lost Butterfly to working around the problem of time constraints with that. And I really hope that Spring Song can do something similar to that with Kirei. In terms of other scenes, I want to talk about Rin as well, because in my opinion, Rin was handled better overall in Lost Butterfly compared to the original visual novel. Rin in Heaven's Field takes the responsibility as Fuyuki's guardian very seriously, and when Sakura loses control, she begins to act as a typical Magus would. Very cold, very logical, and very heartless. It was an understandable change in the character compared to the other routes, since in Heaven's Field, she never got to warm up to Shiro and soften up, especially with Sakura's abilities going out of control. She had to act like a Magus rather than Rin Tosaka. But that never stood well with me though. For me, it felt kind of out of place for what was otherwise described as a kind character that shouldn't be in the role of a typical Magus, and it made certain scenes in the visual novel feel very sudden or even ungenuine. But lo and behold, Lost Butterfly fucking fixed that. In the movie, we only see Rin acting cold one time, and that is at the very beginning when she declares she'll get rid of Sakura, and that's it. She has a lot less friction with Shiro in the movie, since Shiro himself was also undecided on what to do at this point. And when Rin did meet Shiro and Sakura, she simply let them go instead of enacting her pledge to kill Sakura. This felt far more in character compared to the original visual novel, where originally, Rin actually threatened Shiro and Sakura, and announced that Shiro was her enemy as well for his actions. In the movie, we see Rin in general be a lot more conflicted with what to do. She doesn't want to be the Magus, and she wants to save Sakura as well. This let her be a lot more lenient when it came to Sakura, and by the third half where everyone was working together, it didn't feel out of place when Rin was suddenly on board with working with everyone, which it did in the original visual novel. Rin just feels a lot more like she felt in other routes. Like, the scene where we were finally revealed that they are sister was far more impactful here, as it felt like far more of a twist that even Rin evidently struggles a bit with. Plus, when Sakura calls her sister, the scene was honestly really sweet, and the payoff for how Rin's character was handled in these films was far better than what the visual novel originally presented. So massive props to Pseudo for fixing that. Now let's talk about Sakura, the main heroine. I actually changed my thoughts on Sakura in this movie quite a bit. First time I watched it, I felt that she was slightly exaggerated compared to how she was in the visual novel, and I felt that her character wasn't captured as well. However, upon my rewatch and paying more attention, I realized that that wasn't really the case. Now, the thing about Sakura is that she's sort of a yandere, but also not really. Most of her yandere aspects are from inner thoughts that, let's be real, literally everyone has, that have been exaggerated heavily by the grail inside of her because Angra Mainyu is a thing. Because of that, I never really saw Sakura as the kind of person that was possessive or lusting in power, and instead saw Dark Sakura as a different character. Basically Sakura Alter. A Sakura that was corrupted by the Grail and not like her original self at all. A view that was made very evident in that Sakura openly hated and tried to fight that part of herself in the original visual novel, actually telling Shiro to kill her at one point in fear of it. At first, I felt the movie changed that a bit so that yandere part of Dark Sakura became a part of normal Sakura. But upon a rewatch, I instead realized that wasn't the case. I found that the main difference was instead of being outright against those feelings, Sakura in the movie was completely oblivious to them, questioning if she was even talking right after she slipped out dark words. So while she wasn't outright fighting her inner darkness like in the visual novel, Sakura was still the kind-hearted and friendly girl that was most definitely not a yandere. There was one time where she did feel jealous of Rin, but after that we got the H scene to show that Sakura ultimately had nothing to worry about. In fact, that's another thing to note, that Shiro's confession to Sakura was much later compared to the original visual novel. And while it is a change, it's also not worth really noting since it doesn't change much. It does make the jealousy of Sakura feel far more logical though, and just as easily resolved by having the H scene right after. Ultimately, I do prefer how the original visual novel handled Sakura's presentation, but that being said, I also think that the movie is just as valid and equally gets the same point across. As for other scenes I think the movies did fantastically, is that it finally added the fucking monologue in necessary areas. One of the biggest problems a lot of people have with Fate adaptations of any kind is the lack of first-person monologue to properly convey the specific thoughts of the characters. Again, I'm not saying that audiences need to be spoon-fed. In fact, Ufotable did a great job in Lost Butterfly to convey certain emotions without the use of it, like the pain of Shiro when he took off the shroud of Martin. But even so, monologue is really important in a lot of early Nasu works, and especially helps build the character of Shiro a lot. The only adaptation to properly do monologue enough was, I shit you not, Prisma Ilia Thrai, and Oath Under the Snow, as they actually bothered to include monologue in areas where it was truly necessary instead of cutting it all out. This was a problem I had with all the other Fate adaptations, but oh boy, Heaven's Feel 2 finally shows UFO moving on from that. They added monologue in multiple scenes like in flashbacks, in thought processes, and the fucking hug scene that literally slowed down time in order to have that goddamn monologue. That was an idea that I actually thought up with that could have been used in Type Moon anime for monologue, and I'm so damn happy to see UFO do it on their own. This monologue was actually a huge point of worry for me, because Presage Flower lacked a lot of that. Not quite to the detriment of Presage Flower, but instead for Spring Song. There are 3 scenes in Spring Song that heavily rely on that monologue to have such an emotional impact. One of them literally having time slow down to have an entire monologue to make that entire scene work. Lost Butterfly showed me that, yeah, they know now. They've learned since previous adaptations, and that UFO was not going to be as stingy as before when including important character building monologue when it was actually needed. God fucking bless you, Ufotable, for finally learning that lesson. 9-bullet revolver is goddamn saved! Another scene I thought that Lost Butterfly fixed from Presage Flower was the use of the original scene at the beginning of the movie. In the original visual novel, after Shiro realized that Saber was lost, he mourned her as well as painfully accepted the fact that he was no longer a master. While in Presage Flower, I felt that scene was heavily downplayed as the movie saw it fit to shift all the focus on the shadow instead, something that wasn't in the original source at all. However, Lost Butterfly fixes that by giving us a scene where he shows clear worry and fear for not being able to save Saber in time through a dream, and I thought that was very nice. Now, what other scenes were done right? Oh yeah. The forest scene was fucking amazing! Ah! I still think that it was a bit of a wasted opportunity to give Salter more character since, well, Presage Flower seemed to imply Salter would have more personality in its preview. However, in both Lost Butterfly and in the original visual novel, Salter barely had any lines and honestly didn't do that much aside from kill people. She felt not like a character, but just a puppet, and in the original visual novel, she's described to have lost almost all forms of personality. This is actually why I wasn't a fan of Salter until Shinjuku in Fate Grand Order, cause she just had no personality and nothing for me to emphasize with outside of, damn, she's scary as fuck with a badass design. Like, don't get me wrong, that's perfectly fine and it works fine for the story. But it just meant I didn't feel attached to her. I just see her as a mere shadow of the character I loved so much in previous routes, which I guess was the point? But the animation though, ah! I swear to God, you could put the highest expectations on Ufotable's animation and they will still surpass it. I honestly dread the day that Ufotable and Kyoto Animation do a collaboration to make an anime, because that would honestly just destroy the entire industry. I also want to talk about the superhero ending that was shown, The Mind of Steel. In the original visual novel, there was a popular bad end amongst fans where instead of saving Sakura, Shiro decides to kill her in order to pursue the road of a hero of justice. He doesn't take Ilia's sentiment to heart, and with the knowledge of what Kiritsugu would have done as a hero of justice, he lets Sakura die in order to let the Grail War continue normally, and would kill others in order to save the majority, just like Kiritsugu did. We don't see that ending. However, instead we do see that potential form of Shiro in dreams, with darkened skin and white hair. We see that version of Shiro that represented Shiro in the superhero ending, killing Sakura himself. I was so happy to see that Lost Butterfly implemented the superhero ending into the story like that. Once again, genius work! Now, is that everything? I think that's everything. Everything major that I wanted to say or compare at least. So, well, I'm just gonna finish with my personal thoughts. I said in the beginning of the video that Lost Butterfly is great, and it really was, but it was not perfect. As I said in my comparison, a lot of stuff was cut from the original Heaven's Feel visual novel that heavily undermined the depth of certain characters or outright ignored it at other times. Still, I do overall prefer the visual novel for giving that full-rounded experience for all the characters and developing depth for both Ilia and Kirei and keeping them as important players throughout the entire route, rather than have almost the entire route focus on Sakura like the movie. However, I will say that the movie is a great movie overall, and if you haven't read the visual novel, it's a great standalone version of Heaven's Feel to watch. As an adaptation of the visual novel, I'm just going to be honest and say this isn't what I'd call a great adaptation. Specifically just adaptation, as it changed a lot from the story with removing and adding various scenes, and overall, it's surprisingly different from the original source for what claims to be an adaptation. I'd compare it to the anime adaptation of Steins Gate Zero, as both anime are not accurate adaptations of the source material, as they change certain scenes for the sake of getting the story to work in their medium and time frame, thus detrimenting certain scenes as well, and making others lose impact in ways. However, that's not necessarily a bad thing either. I'd say the Heaven's Feel movies are more of a passionate reimagining of the Heaven's Feel route, rather than an adaptation of the visual novel. A reimagining that focuses on Sakura more and has different events, and makes it work for the medium that's meant to be in. It is definitely not the definitive Heaven's Feel experience for all fans, as there are certain things in the visual novel that are just not tackled or shown, and ultimately if you want to get the full experience, you will have to read the visual novel eventually to understand the rules that the world creates, and the depth for a lot of the side characters. Despite this, Lost Butterfly was definitely a fantastic watch, and a great take on Heaven's Feel's story. One that does fall short compared to the visual novel in areas, but also actually succeeds further and improves on the original story as well to make up for that. Overall, I'd give Lost Butterfly alone a 9.3 out of 10, and will definitely say it's a far better film than Presage Flower in my opinion. I definitely think that if you're a completionist, you'll have to experience both versions of the story for the optimal Heaven's Feel experience, even more so than other routes. However, saying all that, Lost Butterfly is definitely one of my favorite adaptations of a Fate anime, allowing me to have a brand new experience that is very different to the visual novel in many ways, adding on to the story that I already saw and making it better in areas. Anyway, those were my thoughts on Lost Butterfly. If you watched the movie, tell me your thoughts on it, and tell me what you thought of the many liberties it took. And go read the visual novel later to get the full experience. If you're a fan of the visual novel, I do highly recommend watching this film to see Heaven's Feel in a different perspective. With all that said, I hope you enjoyed my review and comparison of both iterations of Heaven's Feel. And if you're a Type Moon fan, I urge you to check out my other videos as I make both Fate Grand Order reviews, as well as lore videos revolving around individual characters of the Nasuverse regardless of how obscure they might be. Because I'm really deep into this universe. Anyway, that's all, for real. And I hope to see you in another video on the internet. See ya!